The World's Fair Podcast, number 18. In this episode, we present in its entirety a panel discussion held on September 15th in St. Louis entitled Expo 2020, The Return of a World's Fair in the United States. Well, hello there. This is episode 18 of the World's Fair Podcast. This is Urso Chappell from expomuseum.com. This episode, we do not have John on the line with us because basically we're just going to replay a panel discussion that was held in St. Louis on September the 15th. I was honored to be asked to be on a panel discussion about the possibility of a World's Fair in the United States in 2020 that was held during the International Festival and Events Association convention that was in St. Louis this year. In attendance, in addition to myself, was Barry Howard, who many Expo people might know. He's created 16 Expo pavilions, both here in the United States and abroad, and he's been on the Creative Council to 3 World's Fair organizing committees or their management organizations. And his office served as the theme consultant to Expo 67 in Montreal. He also worked on the American Freedom Train Bicentennial in 1976, and then he also worked on the 1984 World's Fair in New Orleans. He then later on served as a development counsel for the New South Wales celebration at the 1988 Australian Bicentenary. Also, you'll hear Steve Heckler, who's based in the Minneapolis-St. Paul, and he's been in the event business for over 30 years. He's the director of the Festival of Nations there, and just recently got interested in World's Fairs, and he attended the 1964-65 New York World's Fair that was in Flushing Meadows in Queens, New York, as well as Expo 67. Also, as part of the panel, is John Hottinger, who was in the Minnesota Senate from 1991 to 2002, and then later from 2003 to 2006. So without further ado, I present to you the entire panel discussion as it was held in St. Louis, Missouri. The first voice you'll hear is that of Steve Heckler.
I will start basically about a year, or maybe more than that, about a year ago. I began to get an interest in a World Expo coming back to the United States. For the last 5 years, I've been director of Festival of Nations, which is a large multicultural event, and it seemed like a natural progression to look into this. Little did I know how much involvement there is to even consider and where to move from this. And so as I started researching this a little bit, finding out how you would move, I discovered Mr. Urso Chappell's website, and we'll introduce everybody here, who started the U.S. Expo. Was that the name of the site exactly?
Expomuseum.com.
Expo Museum.
Yeah, and then later the Expo 2020 USA.com.
Correct. So Urso's from San Francisco, the Bay Area, and it put together a informational website about 10 years ago. It started?
12 years ago.
12 years, okay. Anyway, that was the place to start, and that's where things are going. So anyway, from that experience, we were trying to see what it would take to bring a World's Fair back to the United States. And I brought in some fantastic folks to talk to, and also John Hottinger from Minnesota. You probably know John. He was a state legislator for, 12 years?
16.
16. I'm off.
I remember vividly.
Remember every moment, don't you?
Yes, exactly.
So
I remember the 4 years since better, though.
And so what I'll start, I'm going to turn it over to Urso, and I'll let you introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and we'll introduce. Basically, Urso is going to describe what a World's Fair is, kind of an overview, just give you an idea and a concept of what the whole procedure is.
So When I've talked to different audiences, different people seem to know different things about World's Fairs, and I'm going to reveal my age. I'm 43 years old, and whenever I talk to anyone who's older than me, I always get the same reaction that World's Fairs, they still go on, and then when I talk to anyone who's younger than me, they just go, World's Fairs, what's that? So we have, many times when I've talked to people, there's been a sort of education gap. So try to sort of put together a sort of brief sort of history of how we've gotten from 1851 up till now, and what's planned for now up until 2015. So I think most people in this audience, festival people, would know that it's a public event consisting of exhibits from multiple nations. What you might not know is that they started in 1851 in London, and Prince Albert created what's generally considered to be the first World's Fair in 1851. And along with the Olympics and the World Cup, they're sort of the three sort of big events, big international events that happen. As we're talking today, you'll probably hear us say World's Fair, World Expo, Expo, International Exposition, and the nomenclature can be kind of confusing, but basically they're all the same thing. Mostly in the United States, we tend to use the term World's Fair. In other countries, it tends to be Expo. It just has to do with mostly the marketing of any individual World's Fair and who they're talking to, but generally they all mean the same thing. Now, the last one in North America was Expo 86 in Vancouver, which is why whenever I talk to anyone who's younger than me, they don't know what a World's Fair is. And then the last one in the United States was in 1984 in New Orleans. And we'll probably talk a little bit about the 84 and the 86 experiences, one which is a little better than the other as far as the results and financially. Currently, you can tell I created this PowerPoint before May because we're currently in Expo 2010, which is in Shanghai. And as I go through some of the more recent ones, I'll have some photos from that. And there's the current schedule for World's Fairs as they're set up by the BIE, which is the Bureau International des Expositions, which is the organizing body, is that we have like a big one every 5 years, which is sort of the short way of saying it, with a sort of small one in between. And the analogy I kind of like to think of is they're kind of like Summer Olympics and Winter Olympics. I don't know if you have the sort of same impression of them, but it's a good way to sort of think about them. And starting with the year 2000, they've set up a schedule that they're every 5 years, 2000, 2005, 2015, and then 2020, and then they allow for one of the smaller ones in between. So after 2010 in Shanghai and after 2015 in Milan, the next big slot is 2020. So up until World War II, you probably have heard of like several events that are World's Fairs. Not everyone always necessarily remembers them, that they are World's Fairs. But you have the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, and then the several Expositions Universelles in Paris. Probably the most famous one, 1889, when they had built the Eiffel Tower for the first time. And then it was reused in 1900 and 1937. Probably everyone here is familiar with the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. That's really well known in the U.S. Here in St. Louis, in what's now Forest Park, was the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition, which until this year had the record for being the largest in area. It was a little over 1,000 acres. In San Francisco, where I live, we've held the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition. And then people might also be familiar with the Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago and the New York World's Fair in 1939. And then sort of like the Olympics, there's a huge gap during World War II. And then you sort of jump to 1958, which I'll get to. I like to... Many times people will say, well, aren't World's Fairs obsolete? Why do we still have World's Fairs? And I was recently reading a book that just came out last year about the history of the Eiffel Tower. And it was interesting that in the 1880s, when they were planning the Eiffel Tower, there were a lot of people saying, World's Fairs, aren't they already obsolete in the 1880s? Why do we still have them? And so the history of World's Fairs to me are kind of a history of them sort of being declared obsolete, and and to me, World's Fairs are a medium, just like other kind of mediums. Obviously, they're very similar to the Olympic Games. They're similar to theme parks. They're similar to museums. Obviously they're festivals, and they're like live entertainment. And we certainly wouldn't say the Olympic Games are obsolete. Certainly wouldn't say that theme parks are obsolete. I always, when people say, well, we don't need World's Fairs, we have the internet. And it's like, well, we don't need theme parks, we have the internet. So next time your kid wants to go to Disneyland, just tell them you'll take them to the Disneyland website and see how far you get. Every museum in the world has like their whole collections on the internet, but yet people still go to museums. There's something about being there in person, and with World's Fairs, it's much the same way. Just being there in person and the experience is a great deal of what it is. And on the internet, you don't get to have that sort of person-to-person meeting aspect that is one of the more rewarding things, at least that I've found in the 8 World's Fairs that I've been to so far. So just to sort of bring us up from World War II up to now, the first World's Fair after World War II is Expo 58, which was held in Brussels. And if people are familiar with Brussels, they probably know the Atomium, which is one of the legacy structures from Expo 58. And people probably also familiar with the Space Needle in Seattle, which is one of the legacies of the Seattle World's Fair in 1862. And Key Arena is also left over from that, and the what's now the Pacific Science Center started out as the United States Pavilion. Yeah, it was the U.S. Science Pavilion, and the monorail is still left over from that as well. And that whole area is still a tourist draw, and people still go there to sort of seek out the World's Fair, even though it's been decades since it was held. A lot of Americans also are familiar with the 1964-65 New York World's Fair, which was held in Flushing Meadows at the same site as the 39-40 World's Fair. And there's a few legacy buildings left over from that, including the Unisphere, which people who watched Men in Black will probably recognize. And the New York State Pavilion was exploded in that movie, but lives on in reality.
Imploded.
You think it should be imploded at the time?
Absolutely.
And Expo 67 in Montreal is also another good example of post uses of expos. If people have been to Montreal, might be familiar with La Ronde, which is the Six Flags theme park that's there now. And historically, it's important for the U.S. Pavilion, which was Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome, which is still there, and you can sort of see it in this sort of supermodel, but it completely created a whole new space within Montreal. There's the U.S. Pavilion. San Antonio hosted a smaller event called Hemisphere 68, which you might be familiar with the Tower of the Americas and the canals there. The U.S. Pavilion is also still used there. I believe it's a courthouse now. That in the photo here is on the sort of lower left-hand side. The first Asian World's Fair was in Osaka, Expo 70, and we'll talk a little bit about Expo 2010 that's happening now, which is China's first World's Fair, and I see a lot of parallels between Japan's first World's Fair and China's World's Fair, and it really does, it is sort of ups the ante as far as both the size and the different things that can be presented in a World's Fair. And it's certainly noteworthy, and people in Japan, all know about Expo 70, and people still go there today. And then in 1974, this tiny, tiny town of Spokane, Washington, became the smallest city to ever hold a World's Fair. And they had what has turned out to be the first of many with an environmental theme. And they completely redeveloped the whole downtown area and the islands that are in the river there. And here's a sort of photo. But a lot of these structures are also left behind as well. And it was, I think, I forgot how you described it earlier, but it was not a very nice place before the Expo.
It was a garbage
bin. Yeah. and I was there just last year, and it's a very nice, pleasant area now. Okinawa hosted a small one called Expo 75, which had the theme of oceans, which became one of many with sort of ocean and water themes. The 1982 World's Fair in Knoxville sort of took the idea of Spokane and moved it to Tennessee in a sort of small city. And people might know it from the Sun Sphere that's there now if you ever go to Knoxville. And if you watch The Simpsons, you might remember it as the Wig Sphere, one of the Simpson episodes then. And then the last World's Fair that was held in the United States was in New Orleans, and you can tell from this photo here, they certainly had their own take on New Orleans. It was a whole different sort of feeling for a World's Fair, and took a lot of sort of New Orleans Mardi Gras aspects of it and to the art, and Barry can talk a lot about that. And of course, Japan went Expo crazy after Expo 70, and now we had Expo 70 and 75, but then hosted Expo 85, which was outside Tokyo. And then the last in North America was Expo 86 in Vancouver. And for those of you who've watched the Winter Olympics this year, a lot of the venues that were used in the Winter Olympics and a lot of the area that's sort of iconic now was sort of first developed at Expo 86. This is an artist rendering that was at the time, but it matches pretty closely what ended up being there. Before Expo 86, this was all sort of it was like Vancouver's backyard. It was just a unused area that was like rail yards, and it was kind of like there would be no reason to go there. And it was called their False Creek area. And if you go there now, it's just gleaming tall condo towers and apartment towers, and it's like the whole city of Vancouver now sort of has a front yard and a backyard and really, not only helped develop Vancouver from an infrastructure standpoint and created this whole stretch of a neighborhood, but put Vancouver on the map. A lot of people maybe had heard of Vancouver, but it wasn't until Expo 86 that people had really gone there and experienced it. And when you talk to people in Vancouver, it's like the whole history of the city is sort of divided up into pre-Expo 86 and post-Expo 86. It's like it's a whole different city, and you could argue that they never would have held the Winter Olympics if they hadn't hosted Expo 86. And there are still several legacy structures left from this. In this rendering, you'll see along the False Creek area with the sort of bright buildings in this artist rendering was the main site. But there's also another building that was on the other side of downtown that you would get to using their SkyTrain system. And that's, if anyone's been to Vancouver, they would know the Canada Place area. And that's become like a big center, and they've built a convention center next door to it. And that served as the Canadian Pavilion at the time, and then that's been left over as a legacy structure. And with the Expo, they also created the SkyTrain system. So they brought in, they were able to create this infrastructure with the sort of excuse of having the Expo and sort of have a sort of deadline to get everything done for when they hosted the World. And here's a shot of it at the time showing the Expo Center, the sort of geodesic dome shape, which is now the Telescience Center, and the SkyTrain, which is now runs all over the city as public transit. Since the last North American Expo, Brisbane, Australia hosted a very similar Expo to Expo 86, Expo 88 in Brisbane. And then Seville hosted a rather large one, Expo 92 in Seville, and we might touch on this a little bit later, because Chicago was originally planned to host a sort of Expo 92 in the U.S. to Expo 92 in Seville, but the Chicago one did not happen.
The 500th anniversary of Columbus's trip to this hemisphere.
Yes.
So
The Europeans finding,
1992.
So just like the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 celebrated the 401st anniversary of Columbus, Expo 92, the idea is that it was the 500th, and it did so under the theme of the Age of Discovery. So they sort of took the sort of germ of that and then sort of generalized the theme to talk about discovery in general. So with the larger expos, they have more generalized themes, whereas the smaller ones, like Expo 93 in Taichung, South Korea, which had a more specific theme. And then another one, Expo 98 in Lisbon, Portugal had an oceans theme, and with that they were able to develop a whole area of the city that hadn't. It was basically again wasteland before that, and with a brand new aquarium, which is shown here, and a brand new train station signed by Calatrava, as well as like a whole waterfront area that was not there before, and it's like a big thriving area now. In fact, a friend of mine who moved to Lisbon, every time he goes to that neighborhood, he's like, he wished he could go to Expo 98, and he always gives me updates on what's going on the site now. Hanover hosted a very large one called Expo 2000. I have a couple photos here just showing the Dutch pavilion as seen from the German Post pavilion there. The next large one after that was in Aichi Prefecture, outside Nagoya, Expo 2005, which had as its theme, nature's wisdom. Again, a sort of broad, encompassing environmental theme. 2 years ago in Zaragoza, Spain, they hosted Expo 2008. Again, this is an undeveloped area that was practically next to downtown. I mean, I walk there from downtown every day, and this is again the sort of smaller, more compact area, and had as its theme water. And then that brings us to this year, Expo 2010, and some images here. This is the China Pavilion, which is a huge 200-foot tall structure that will be left behind after the Expo. Here's another one of the structures that's going to be left behind, the Expo Axis with the China Pavilion in the background. So this site is 1,300 acres, and to put that into perspective, that's 2 square miles. And one of my other favorite statistics about the area is that the country of Monaco has a pavilion there, and the country of Monaco is 1/3 the size of the Expo site. So there are countries that are exhibiting at this World's Fair who are smaller than the World's Fair. But at 1,300 acres, it's just a huge, gigantic site. Here's the United Kingdom Pavilion, which is it was a temporary building, but is becoming much beloved. And you sort of see that each pavilion, it can be very different. Some of them will have static exhibits. Most of them will have like audio-visual type experiences. And then things like the Switzerland Pavilion here have an actual ride component to it. Here's the Israel Pavilion, just sort of showing you some of the sort of typical pavilions. Here's the Denmark Pavilion, where they've brought the Little Mermaid statue from Copenhagen. So if you go to Copenhagen right now, you can't see the Little Mermaid because it's in Shanghai. So that brings us up to today. Is the Portugal Pavilion. And again, the Expo Axis, which is permanent. So, and then as I said earlier, the next 2 expos are Expo 2012 in Yeosu, South Korea, which again has an oceans theme, and Expo 2015 in Milan, which will have a Feeding the World theme. It'll be about food and access to food. So after this, we have 2017 or 2018 would be a small one, or 2020, and then the next large one is 2020. And I threw this image up there, which was released just a few days ago, which shows one of the proposals for a World's Fair in the Silicon Valley. And this area is currently it's a defunct naval base that right now has NASA offices and an air base, which is scheduled to be closed next year. But if you looked at that now, that's mostly runway. And this is, anyway, their proposal may have heard that Arnold Schwarzenegger has announced in Shanghai with the Bay Area Council. So sort of brings us to where we are today, which is it's been 26 years since the last World's Fair in the United States. By the year 2020, it will have been 36 years, which is a big gap. So, you asked why has it been so long?
Just a moment.
Well, that's a lot of why we're here today, because we would, I think everyone here is very eager to see a World's Fair in the United States again. And I think there are a lot of different components to answering the question of why we haven't had one in a while. And I think the answers are just as varied, and they include things like money, which of course always plays a role, but also just perception of like what World's Fairs are and what they are. So I think a lot of it is education. And
we have to throw into the mix the fact that the United States of America is not a member of the governing body that controls or schedules World Expositions in Paris, BIE. We haven't been a member since, when did we faded away?
Yeah, we stopped paying our dues in 2002, I believe, and then 2 years later we were automatically...
but we were only a member for a brief period of time. There's a long period of time earlier than that we weren't participating. And the BIE has taken a fairly dim view of the U.S. attitude toward the global family of nations, something I think we have to dispel pretty soon before we find ourselves cast away. So that's part of our conversation.
Yeah.
And the podcast, as we're talking here, just if you have a question, also talk in the mic so we can get. No, it's fine. Just to introduce Barry Howard, who is also here, who has created 16 exposition pavilions, both here and abroad, and has been creative counsel to 3 World Fairs organizing committees and management organizations. I don't think I get into all detail, but he's been around since. There's been 3 consultants in the been a theme consultant to the 1967 Montreal World Exposition, designed and produced the American Freedom Train Bicentennial Exposition in 1976, when Philadelphia opted not to reprise its 1896 pavilion. And what I think, as you're working, as we're talking on this, the historical benefits of what a World's Fair is, some of the long-term positive results of the city, and following up the positives, but why? It's a fair question. With the positive benefits, all the infrastructure things that happen, as Urso has shown, what are the positive benefits, and what would be the holdup if we continue this?
Well, those of us, as Urso mentioned, those of us who are concerned with this sort of super festival, if you can think of it that way, we have been debating for some time how to create a new exposition in this country sometime before it's too late. And all the photographs, and Urso is a wonderful historian and has kind of given you a lot of background. And except for 3 of those expositions, I either worked there or was there. And I was very party to why a governing body was established for a particular city somewhere in the world to create a world exposition. And it wasn't only the immediate benefit. It had to be viewed as a long-term benefit. For example, Montreal in 1967, one of those strong motivating factors, aside from the fact that they had 3 islands that were kind of like just going to waste adjacent to mainland in Montreal, they had a problem with the frozen over port every winter. They wanted a 12-month port. And the only way they could do it, basically, was by creating attention to bringing a couple of million people to Montreal. That focused the mayor's attention on the fact that, well, they'd have a problem because the harbor was always iced over in the wintertime and we wouldn't be able to work. So that was kind of like a sub rosa argument for creating that exposition. And although in the short term, Montreal was an expensive adventure, and a lot of people in Canada were very upset about that, in the long term, it was enormously beneficial to the city of Montreal. And that could be said about every expo that Urso covered, with a couple of caveats. One, that the permanent benefit of Expo 82 in Knoxville was kind of questionable because the leftover buildings, nobody had the money to preserve or maintain, which is why the New York State Pavilion stayed on the premises of the New York World's Fair 1964 forever. Nobody had the money to maintain the building, and they couldn't afford to tear it down. So it just sat there, sort of moldering away.
If you go there today, it's like a decaying building, and it's an
what.
amazing building, and they keep talking about redeveloping it.
Architecturally, though, it was a deteriorating building before he designed it. So
One of the ironies is this is just a very odd aside that I don't even know if you know. If you go to the Universal Studios Orlando, there's a Men in Black ride, and they copied that building for the ride. So the irony is that there's a better copy of it that's in much better condition than the original, while the original decays.
I found two of the environments of the Coca-Cola Pavilion that I did in 1964 in a restaurant in Singapore.
We have a
So
question.
anything is possible.
Yeah. You just introduce yourself and ask her.
I'm Beth Payne from St. Paul, Minnesota. My question is, how long does the World Fair last? You mentioned Urso, the different sizes of space needed for this. How many, so for a community to take this on?
6 months.
It's a 6
It's
months.
a standard expo.
Okay, and it can go from square footage of what you said to, what's the biggest one? Is it in China right now?
Yeah, so the large ones that I talked about that are held every 5 years, those run for 6 months. The new ones, like the one in 2008 in Zaragoza and the one that'll be in 2012 in Yosu, actually will only run 3 months, and they limit it to that just because they want to, and they also limit the number of the acreage to a much smaller size. But the large ones can be any size, and they could be 100 acres to like 1,300 acres as they are this year.
And then my other question is maybe two-part is, you keep mentioning there's a pavilion involved in every expo, the pavilion, I was trying to the right building. Is that something that's unique to that specific area, the World Fair, that stays that you mentioned in New York?
Well, pavilions are really the medium of expression at world expositions. They can be sponsored or built by nations. They can be sponsored or built by industrial companies. At the New York World's Fair in 1964, the corporate pavilions overshadowed the international pavilions. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, they spent in the magnitude of 4 times what was done by the so-called international pavilion.
And I mean, I would hazard a guess that in this room, most people have been to the Pepsi Pavilion from the 64-65 World's Fair, but they probably don't know it because they went to It's a Small World at Disneyland. And that originally started out as the Pepsi Pavilion at the New York World's Fair, and they got repurposed at Disneyland.
And the same thing was true about the GE Pavilion.
Yeah, the GE became the Carousel of Progress.
Carousel of Progress went back
and
to
the State of Illinois Pavilion is also at Disneyland still.
And one last question for me. With a 6-month commitment, what's the economic activity that brings, I mean, I kind of imagine it's got to be an amazing number. And why wouldn't we want it back in the United States?
Oh, there's no question that it draws people. I mean, even a moderately successful exposition is going to draw 25 or 30 million people in 6 months. I mean, what is China going? What are they doing?
They were officially saying that they were expecting 70 million visitors.
70 million visitors in 6 months.
But I have heard that they have printed up 100 million tickets.
So, I mean, you could certainly imagine that an exposition in the United States in 2020 could easily draw 15 or 20 million people in a 6-month period of time, I would think.
Yeah, the smallest ones were more like 10 million, but generally they tend to be in that 20 to 40 million area as a goal.
It's a lot of folks.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, there's no question about the fact that it's very worth doing.
Introduce
Please.
yourself.
I'm Randy DeWitz, and I'm also from Minnesota. My question is, I'm hearing about World Fair, is there a geographic area in the United States that you're looking at? I saw the one noted in Silicon Valley. Or are you also considering other parts of the country?
Well, we are sitting here as kind of like objective in our thinking. There would be a couple more of us at this table if they could have made it, who we think of ourselves as being relatively expert in this medium. And we don't have any preconceptions about good, bad, or indifferent. I do have a thought that we've kicked around a little bit that would be very different than has been done in the past.
Okay,
and we're going to talk about it.
Yeah, before we get to that, this is just a preliminary talk of just what, this is not a decision body of any sort. This is just I bringing folks together, ideas to throw out, get feedback of what would be necessary, what the history is, and where to move forward.
I would say, though, that proposals have been put forward in this dark period when we haven't had an expo in this country. There was a proposal from some folks in Atlanta who wanted to reuse their Olympic site. And it didn't have any local support, and it kind of faded away. There's been some folks from Houston who would like to utilize some of their infrastructure for an expo, but they haven't got any traction yet either. And people have thought about this from time to time. And as I say, one of the problems is that we are not a member of the organizing body in Paris. And one would think, although it's not mandatory, 1964 and 1965, which was a 2-year exposition in New York, was not a sanctioned exposition. The BIE did not recognize that exposition officially, and yet there was plenty of participation on the part of members of the BIE because this was the United States of America. They didn't want to be absent,
And then thinking again, and then how do we become a member of that board in the United States?
We have to rejoin that. It's something that has to be done at the federal level.
And what's the fee for that?
I think we owe them $100,000 in back dues. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago I talked to the Secretary General of the BIE, and he was like, well, you could just host a party and probably get the funds to pay your dues.
It wasn't the money. There was some philosophical, neither Urso and I really know why. But
yeah, I've talked with many people, and basically what we did in 2002 is the Congress stopped funding the BIE, and then after 2 years of that, we ended up not being a member. But no one can seem to trace anyone who is against membership in the BIE. It's just we didn't pay our dues. And the only sort of speculation I've ever heard is that this was during the whole period of sort of anti-French attitudes in Congress. And the BIE, which is the Bureau International des Expositions, guess what? Those are all French words.
It's
based in Paris, and it just happens to be based in Paris, and that could have been the reason, but no one's ever really been able to explain why we're no longer a member.
As far as we know, is small-mindedness, and I think the clue to what we might think about for 2020 that we have been discussing ourselves internally was the notion of perhaps identifying 3 or 4 different cities that would participate under the aegis or banner of, let's say, something arbitrarily called Expo America. And if we could identify Twin Cities, San Francisco, maybe a couple of other cities from west of the Mississippi, there are some very practical reasons to do that. To mount an exposition the size of Shanghai is almost impossible to contemplate. Even those that were smaller than Shanghai in gross size, we're still talking about $3 billion. And in an economy where we're scratching our heads to figure out how to get jobs for folks, and a lot of states are, including California, are way behind the 8 ball in terms of their budgetary crises, there is a relatively practical reason for thinking about a way of dividing the responsibility for both fundraising and day-to-day administration of a site. You know, it's not just the cost of putting the expo up. You've got to run it, and it's an expensive operation. You guys are festival guys. Think about a festival that runs for a week or 2 weeks, running it for 6 months at the same steady level of staffing, the same steady level of support. It's a huge operation. So by dividing it up logically into 4 components, each of which reinforces the other, I think we might have a way. This is a very innovative notion. The BIE, if they were approached this way, I wouldn't approach them until we have a very sound, solid plan with money behind it and, you know, all of the things you need to get their attention. Otherwise, we're going to be one city vying against cities all over the world who are looking for the opportunity to host an expo in 2020. So that's just my thought.
We have the Minnesota folks here. I think it would be great for Minnesota to have this kind of thing, and cooperating with other cities to share the revenue, share the cost of the thing is really what's being on the table here as a possible option to make this happen. I mean, I'm not even sure you could pitch Minnesota to raise $3 billion. I'm just thinking that might be tough right now, because we know these folks here will know exactly what I'm talking about. So if you share that and show a good financial plan and be able to do that. So again, these are just options. We're just throwing out options, discussing what would...
It's certainly one I like, because I think that is a practical issue. It would be easier to create an expo that represented this country rather than an expo that represents an individual city or even a state. That's just something we're kicking around.
Yeah. But I think even if you were to go with the sort of traditional model, I think getting multiple cities makes sense, because if you look at the way that we bid for Olympics in this country, it no longer becomes a question of whether or not a U.S. city should bid for a specific Olympics in a specific year. It becomes framed around which U.S. city will then be the U.S. bid for an expo. So I'm hoping to encourage people from different cities to all be interested in creating this, and whether or not it becomes more the traditional model or the model that you're thinking of. I think having people from all around the country involved in this, I think, is the
You need a major way
the best way to go.
to create what we call the buzz. You need a major way. The time 2020 rolls around, it will be 30, almost 40 years till there has been one here, if we get one. And you're going to need a way to generate the excitement. I just think it's a great proposal to do that. I mean, you'd have high-speed rail connecting cities. You know, you might have an airline that might sponsor to fly you, kind of a loop kind of thing. But I'd like to give John a little time to talk a little bit about whatever on this conversation.
Well, I'm the least educated in terms of having the experience that these wonderful people do. But I've listened to them and I've learned from them, and they're a tremendous value, and you folks know better than anybody the value. Whether it's an iconic structure, whether it's the fame and fortune of actually having it in your community, whether it's presenting your community on not only the national stage but the world stage. There's so much return for local communities that host us, but it's broader than that. The country, the United States, is in need probably of a little reinvigoration on the world stage, and showing a cooperative side of the United States, welcoming people from around the world, opening up the trade avenues that can be opened up. There's a very persuasive argument behind the concept of having a World's Fair in the United States in 2020. The ideas that we've heard today from these folks about potentially getting a collaborative agreement between 4 communities. Can you imagine the technology we'll have in 2020? I mean, just compared to now to 2000, the social networks didn't exist. A whole lot of things didn't exist. The kind of interactive TV really engaging and enveloping people didn't exist. 10 years from now, we're going to have other opportunities, and the effort to plan and put together an effort that will anticipate that sort of situation can present a plan that's very innovative, as mentioned by the speakers, but also very futuristic and very welcoming. So I like this concept, and again, I'm a new boy in this block. and this is about one of the few blocks I'm still a new boy on. But it's a really interesting aspect, and the things that we need to sell. First of all, there's some strange congressional laws that really empower Congress in this area. $100,000 is what they drop in the way to the restroom. I mean, it's not a big event in terms of money compared to the federal budget, but for some reason they've really isolated international expositions in a way that we have to go through a little more hoops to get this done because of some of the negative legislation in the past. So we have to work on that. We have to get local governments involved, state governments, regional governments. High-speed rail between North Dakota and Ohio was a regional government effort that took 6 years to get agreement on. So that's the workforce we're looking at. We have to build a support level, not only the buzz, but also get local business leaders, again, your festival folks, you know what this is all about. Building local business leaders, local government officials, local community people behind an effort to do planning. And that in collaboration, if it's other communities, is a very significant thing. But the infrastructure benefits for a community, just imagine what we could have in Minnesota, they could have in San Francisco. That could be lasting, makes it a good investment. The identity, the image of the community is a lasting one. There's transformation. I mean, the picture of what your community is can be transformed with some of this. So there are so many arguments that I've learned about that really put together a good case for having a World's Fair. We just have to get past some barnacles from the past in terms of the legislation. We have to get a little more honorable position with the folks at BIE, a little more welcoming. We have to do the fundraising that's necessary to get something like this started. Again, U.S. Festival people know how important that is. And we have to put together that private sector government partnership that's going to be necessary to make it the kind of thing it could be. So I've learned a lot as I've gotten involved in this, and someone who comes from more of a government background, I understand what we have to do in order to get this done. But it's a great lost opportunity that we've passed up for a very, very long time. And we need to be proactive to try and change that.
Well, I do think that, as Urso said, we need to establish a dialogue, and we need to get these ideas out on the table, and to reinforce just the thoughts that you've expressed, is that this is a valuable asset that we are wasting. It's also, I feel personally, that there's an opportunity to demonstrate to the rest of the world that we are not exclusive, that we are a member of the global community. And despite a number of actions over the past couple of decades which challenge that idea, if we could, as our theme, in my mind, I would like to see our theme be one of inclusiveness, because I think that's what this country has always been about, even though it's been overshadowed by other interests. If we could become an inclusive nation again and embrace those people who are not only here, but are still coming to these shores daily, I think that we could make this happen. And so the idea of a multi-city vision might be considered to be inclusive of more than one city, which is sort of consistent thematically. And I think we can demonstrate, without having to do it artificially, that we are an inclusive people. We are certainly the most multi-ethnic nation in the world, and have accommodated people from all over the world. Why shouldn't we continue to demonstrate how that works for us?
Well, I mean, I've been very encouraged by the efforts in Houston to sort of get the interest there, and I've been particularly excited. We touched a little bit on what Arnold Schwarzenegger announced in Shanghai this past week with the Bay Area Council for something for the Silicon Valley. But I think if you have different communities within the U.S. all talking about this, then it then becomes less an issue of whether we should, but who should, and how should we do it. And I think that that's a better place to be.
We have, do you have any comment? I mean, from Minnesota, we have some. I guess you folks are from St. Louis, right? We sound folks. If you have any comments, I'd like to hear from you.
Interesting. Where do you get your funding?
Can you come up just with this? Sorry. No one will hear the question.
Yeah, I'm recording this for a podcast as well, so.
Are you guys funded? And if you are,
No.
No.
We're here voluntarily.
So it's just all voluntary.
We'd not like to be here voluntarily for too much longer.
So what we need to do is go to 25,000 hotels, get $100 a piece.
Exactly. You got it.
It's got to start somewhere with someone, or some corporation, some foundation that has confidence in the fact that we need to do an expo in this country
Or
again.
an industry that has an interest in that kind of economic.
So we can bring together a few more people there are some other expert people than just Urso and myself.
Yeah, I've been really encouraged that a lot of people have all come up with some of the same ideas, like 2020 being the year that it can finally happen. And it's like when people in New York, people in Los Angeles, people in Houston are all coming up with the same idea at the same time, then sort of think something might just happen. And it might just be a matter of getting all these people together.
And it's a good date for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it's far enough away so that it can be developed. It's not tomorrow. And it's close enough so that the generation that's involved with it will see it happen. And it's a very good date right now.
This group, we need to fund this group by getting participation from.
We do.
I'm in the hospitality industry, that's why I ask. And it's very frequent we go and get $5 from a hotel, every hotel in the country for some particular fund. So I was just curious how you guys were funded and what your ideas were.
Well, if Bill
This is
Gates
the- this
was
is
an
the-
Expo fan, that would be helpful.
We'd love to be able to have a proposal in Minnesota. I mean, that's really, obviously, being myself from there. I mean, I'd like to work with multi-city. I believe that's a great model to at least go with. But we'd love to pitch it before we can even attempt to do this, That's why I brought John over here and folks, experts like these, together. How would you even start this? It has, like I said, the 26-year gap. 2020 is, if we don't do this, if we don't move on this, I figured if I didn't get at least some action going here, just to start something, what happens is people are going to start going away. It will never have this. Because the knowledge base will start going away really fast if we don't start moving on this. And even us folks in the festival business sitting out here, you in hospitality, we have to pass things along. If we don't start thinking in those terms, like the event I do, Festival of Nations, we run into this all the time. You have ethnic groups or younger folks are no longer identifying themselves with the ethnic group. They're mixed, their mom's this, dad's this, and next generation is 8. And so people will age out. And so it requires folks to step up and say, look, this is a very important event for this community, a very important event for the country. And as John was eloquently said this perfectly, we need to do this to showcase what the United States stands for here. And we think a World's Fair is a great way to do that. Right?
Randy DeWitt's Minnesota. Question I have is, we're doing a lot of discussions, but what in your minds is our next step, or next 1 or 2 steps to do to move it forward?
I'm going to have each of you answer that question.
Well, traditionally, every exposition has started with a grassroots organizing committee. That's kind of why they're defined that way, as an organizing committee. It's usually bankrolled by a corporation or by a foundation in the city that is making the most noise about the idea. So now that you fixed the bridge, and I go to the Guthrie all the time anyway, so I like the idea of the Twin Cities as a locus. And now that Arnie has announced this intention for Silicon Valley, I'm very excited. San Francisco has, I've been involved in 2 efforts in the Bay Area over the last 10 years to create an exposition in San Francisco. And we were unable to get state traction at the governor's level. At least I wasn't able to. But now that he has announced this initiative, I would certainly think that we need to have this panel discussion in San Francisco. And we need to have it in Minneapolis. And before we know, the gentleman from Houston who's been trying to get some support would invite us to have this same discussion in Houston. And if someone else comes to the table, St. Louis, whatever it is, I think it would be healthy, as Urso says, to have the same dialogue. Maybe the outcome will be, look, that was a nice idea, but it's impractical. We in San Francisco are committed to raising $3 billion. We in Minneapolis, we have the resources, or whatever. And we'll all get behind something because we're all conscious of the fact that this country needs to have this expo in 2020.
John, how would you respond to that?
Well, I can't change anything of that. I mean, what we have to do is put together that organizing committee. For instance, just in talking with Steve, I was just telling him we should talk to the business partnership. We should talk to the downtown councils in Minneapolis, like the Bay Area Council is doing something. If they have the imagination in Minneapolis and St. Paul to do something, we should find out. Cargill has a big exposition or a pavilion, as I understand it, in Shanghai. I've spoken to Cargill a little bit about providing some feeder money. I mean, we got to get $100,000 or something to start building the facility in terms of producing the buzz and building the contacts. But that sort of creation of a local community organization becomes essential. And if we can find out Minnesota's interested, great. The Bay Area is already great. They've started something in Houston already. So that's what we need to do at the local level, and then continue this discussion, which is a very important initial step, to make sure that we build, first of all, the momentum to have one in the United States in 2020. And then we can work out the details, but we have to build that momentum, and in doing that, we have to build some local community support in a few key communities.
I think it's a key factor that the impetus is homegrown, that it starts, don't look to Washington to instigate this, because it'll never happen. Started from the grassroots, and then when you have a credible proposal that you could put in front of the then President of the United States, whoever that happens to be, hopefully it'll be the one fast enough so it's the one who's there now, then we can get some support at the federal level. But it's got to come from grassroots.
Well, and just getting back to the sort of timing aspect, we're talking about the year 2020, and I'm sure people are going, "Why are you talking about 2020? It's still 10 years off." Well, so but starting next year, someone is likely to bid for Expo 2020, and the way that the process goes is that starts a 6-month clock for any other competing cities to put something together. So by the end of 2011, we may have all of the different competing cities. Right now in Thailand, they've narrowed down their choices to 3 cities, and they're trying to find out something in Turkey, Izmir, which almost
2017, you mean?
No, 2020
for
2020. And in Turkey, Izmir, Turkey almost won 2015, competing against Milan, and they're very eager to continue, trying, and they're competing with Ankara to be the Turkish bid. There, I've seen reports from United Arab Emirates and a whole slew of other cities in Australia who are all talking about 2020. Most of these won't pan out. I think it's likely we'll have maybe 3 or 4 cities bidding, but it'll happen in 2011 or 2012. So that's why we're talking about now.
Let's talk about seed money. It's one thing to say, okay, maybe we need 150,000 or whatever to get this thing organized. But to make a presentation to the BIE, that's another story. We're no longer in a place where you can put up 5 slides and a fictitious rendering on some piece of property. They want all the information. They want to know what are your financial guarantees, can you pull this off, etc.
Yeah, which I mean, just like when we host the Olympics in the United States,
exactly.
In other countries, pretty much the governments will bankroll everything. But the way we tend to like to do them in the United States is we tend to like to have private industry support them. So that becomes trickier because it's kind of harder to have those guarantees. If the government isn't the biggest bankroller.
Come on up. Let's make sure you get in the mic.
Is this something that has to be sanctioned, or is that just an option?
Preferably, I think we all agree it would be preferable to have BIE bless this because it brings with it the absolute participation of members.
Right. My understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there are about 100, 150 right now member countries that are signed in with the BIE, and unless it's a sanctioned event, many of these countries cannot participate. So you'd lose a large percentage of them.
Or would be inclined not to.
It would be right. So you probably lose
Yeah.
many. So it becomes, as 2020 is, I think these numbers, as more and more member countries participate with the BIE, your event in 2020 will be very minimal.
We should
you would be
mention, though,
sacrificing.
we should mention, though, Steve, that the U.S. membership in the BIE really is a separate issue from this discussion of a 2020 Expo, even though they're related. Because if the U.S. is going to appear in Milan in 2015, which is only 5 years away, it would behoove the U.S. government to rejoin the BIE and then to create an initiative at the federal level to create a U.S. pavilion at that Expo, which has yet to happen and better happen soon. Otherwise, the Secretary of State is going to be mortally embarrassed, if she isn't already.
Well, as we talked about, the bottom line is these events have been happening around the world and in a big way, and they just have not happened here. And we're missing out. I think that's the big picture, and we really need to participate. Randy, did you have any comments on I'd like to hear from being the executive director of the Minnesota contingency.
I'm Randy Guthrie with Minnesota Festivals and Events, and certainly, in the Midwest, I spend time on the advisory council for the Office of Tourism, and we are still a part of the country that's going from the manufacturing age to the service age, as we've seen our ag industries in particular decline. So without a doubt, the concept of this expo and serving people, there's perhaps kind of a play on that concept just based on the fact that as a state in particular, we're really coming to terms with our notion of the service industry as college kids in the summer making minimum wage, and we're trying to prove to ourselves that there is more to tourism. There's more to what this expo potentially represents, and so from a timing standpoint, I think certainly the Midwestern part of the country, where we are in Minnesota, is trying to come to terms with that shifting in economies, and everyone talks ad nauseum about the fact that it is a world economy as well. So
the other part, Randy, is Minnesota. When I moved there in '85 from New York, and it was mostly, I would say, Norwegians and
yeah,
so it's talking very funny with funny accents. I was, Wolf does and all, talking. And in 2010, we have one of the largest Somali communities, and if no one in the world knows, we have one of the largest Hmong community. We have the Burmese, the Karen, as we were talking about. We have this huge Korean refugee population in there now. And they're going to be included in our community. And the whole notion of inclusion is so critical right now. They're here, they work. Our city, the city of Minnesota, or Twin Cities in general, is a different.
The Native American community is one of the largest in the country.
Yeah, the Native American community is, there are more ethnic Native American tribes in Minnesota than anywhere, right?
Well, a lot of well-intentioned Lutherans and Catholics in Minnesota have reached out to bring people to our wonderful, sometimes cold part of the country. And so that opportunity on a grand scale, I see fitting where at least we are trying now as components of tourism, and that I don't mean to minimize the expo by using that term, but it captures for me at least kind of the shifting in economies that goes on for us. So something like this, without a doubt, would raise that concept.
People, the perception, I think, would be a sale factor.
Right. Or, quite frankly, would force people to kind of ask that question, well, why Minnesota?
How many national corporations, Fortune 500, are there?
21. Well, I do want to note for the record that when you said sometimes cool, the Californian in the panel was the one who was chuckling.
Well, first of
The
all,
two Californians, I'm over here cold. You just put on a jacket.
expositions are always held in the summer months,
Right.
World Expositions. The kids are out of school, generally. A lot of this is for kids. And so you can imagine that it will be a May to October or April to September 6-month period. So weather is not an issue. But I was in Hibbing one day at the Mesabi Iron Range. I won't go into that story right now.
And as Steve and I have talked about this concept, I've joked with him too. And in Minnesota, there are a lot of us who have been brought up from a vantage point. If you're having fun, perhaps you're probably doing something wrong. So, so we have to get over that hurdle.
Yeah, Perry.
Well, I mean, I think we've kind of covered a lot of territory here, and I think, Steve, I must say, since you have been the one who's been pulling the horses here, you're going to have to pull a little more.
I'm here. I'm going to grab harder.
Urso and I think, are in agreement that we're happy to support this and to sustain the dialogue and get people talking about this. Yes, absolutely.
Well, for you out, this is a start, especially those listening on the podcast. This is a start, the beginning. And we have to get legs to this. This has to move. We needed a starting point. And I think we
I think it'll be very interesting when this is aired as a podcast. And this is just something I would think about, that somewhere at the end of the podcast, perhaps you might suggest that if anybody has any comments, they might want to get in touch with Steve. You'd be surprised how many people might, in fact, express themselves along these lines. It'd be interesting to hear what we get back.
My email is Steve Heckler, 1 at gmail.com. But people will be able to answer questions. The format of this podcast, so people will be able to.
Yeah, actually, we have a phone number set up that you can call, which is area code 650 Ask Expo. I was able to get Ask Expo, although it's not just for questions; it's for comments as well. But where people can call in and leave questions and comments and things like that. And at the end of the podcast, I always give contact information of like Facebook and Twitter and emails, and it's like if people can't get a hold of me at that point, then something's wrong.
I mean, the fact is, we don't know that there aren't 3 people in Cincinnati having this conversation that don't want to go public because they don't have enough critical mass.
Yeah, I'm a very visual thinker. I mean, I'm a graphic designer by trade, and my mental image is that we're kind of in the center, trying to like bring everyone together, because I mean, I know people are talking about this all over the country, and if we could just sort of get that critical mass of people, then I think something can happen.
Social networks and websites? I noticed your websites earlier in the...
Yeah. My own website, which I've had for 12 years, is expomuseum.com, and I've developed a site that's specifically for this goal, which is the Expo 2020 USA.com site, and that also has links to other efforts that are out there, and so everything's interconnected into Facebook and Twitter and all the different ways to get a hold of people. And I mean, it's especially with technologies like that, you're obviously going toward younger generations of people who use those technologies, and that's one of the more satisfying things for me, is because there's a whole generation that in the United States who's never seen a World's Fair, and perhaps wouldn't even know what they were unless they went, oh yes, the Eiffel Tower, or oh yes, that crazy looking globe that they have in Queens, and then it's that participation that I'd really like to see, because then that'll propel us into the 20s and the 30s, the 2020s and the 2030s and the 2040s, when we're all gone.
What is the economic impact of a fair that brings in 70 million people? I mean, do we have any statistics available on that?
About what? I'm sorry.
The economic impact of such a festival? I mean, there is statistical information about the impact of a whole series of expositions in the past. It's too early to know about Shanghai, because you have to have some distance between the event and what happens. But there's information about the after effects, impact, residual benefits of all the expos that Urso covered.
the ones in this country we could certainly identify, and I think the information's available for those in Asia and Europe as well.
Yeah, one person that we were hoping to have here is Gordon Linden, who's put together a book called The Expo Book, and that's at theexpobook.com. And he sort of outlines a great deal of that as well. But each expo kind of has its own characteristic and own experience. And I find myself talking a lot to people in the themed entertainment industry and who work in amusement parks and theme parks, and I kind of say, well, each expo is kind of its own thing, just like Six Flags is different than Disneyland, is different from Cedar Point, is different from Silverwood and Idaho, and they each will have their own successes and failures depending on their own local conditions. But there's certainly the sort of tangible aspects of hosting the expo, and you would really hope that there would be an economic aspect to it. But I think oftentimes it gets overlooked is the sort of more intangible ones that you see down the road. Until 1984, the biggest sort of disaster World's Fair was 1884 New Orleans, which sank into the mud on opening. Half the site sank into the mud on opening day. And then, of course, in 1984, it declared bankruptcy during its run.
Let's not discuss that.
Yeah, we'll discuss 1884.
Too painful.
But just a few weeks ago, I was back in New Orleans with, oddly enough, a television crew from China because they were covering previous expos. And so it was kind of fun to just sort of like go into the streets of New Orleans and talk to people about what they remember from the 84 World's Fair. And everyone had such glowing memories of what a great time it was and how, people, went there and they came back to New Orleans. And I'm like, wow, you don't know that this lost a lot of money. But it's like, it's funny how time sort of makes it this great event,
Actually,
Yeah.
the problem in New Orleans actually started with the site. It was an impossible site. It was divided by a series of recessed tracks along the site that divided the site automatically into two areas that were very difficult to deal with. And it was encompassed along one long side of the site by a series of high voltage, elevated electrical systems that could not be buried in the ground, had to stay there. And that's how the Wonder Wall was created. It was the divider that shielded the audience from that series of electrical poles. The planning that we went through on that site, it almost had two strikes against it before we got to day one. And we all knew it. It was a very difficult site.
Yeah, and again, sort of talking, when I talk to people in the theme park industry, there's, I don't know how familiar you are with amusement parks and theme parks, but there was an amazing theme park that opened a couple years ago, and everyone I talked to loved this theme park. It was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and it was called Hard Rock Park. It was themed on the Hard Rock restaurants and everyone loved all the different attractions. Everyone just went crazy for all the different things, and it went bankrupt its first year, and it was sold, and now it's called something else. And I said, well, okay, so if the theme park world worked the way that the World's Fairs have worked in the U.S. in the last few decades, then that means, that one failed. So I guess amusement parks don't work. You would never think that way.
Well, you can't quite think that way because, the Olympics began in Greece, and what happened to Greece?
Well, also, just the economic impact. When you think of the Seattle Space Needle, just for a second, it was built in '62, the legacy we talked about, and the revenue that's still bringing. Yeah, so let's just say Seattle lost money. It didn't. Sitting in the Eiffel Tower, you'd make the same argument, even though I don't know what the economic. Let's say it lost $20 million. It didn't.
The Space Needle was the most lampooned piece of architecture in probably 30 years before and after that exposition. It was the adventure of a builder who was willing to risk his money to build a restaurant that rotated on the top of a large tower. Nobody believed it could be done. They thought it was a great joke, and it has become an icon of the city of Seattle.
Well, people thought of that of the Eiffel
The
Tower.
Eiffel Tower, same thing.
The Eiffel Tower was only supposed to last 2 or 3 years, and there were
Exactly the
many
same
people
thing.
in Paris who were like, they couldn't wait for them to finally tear that monstrosity down. Because what will people think of Paris if they,
Well,
if they
that's-
see that Eiffel Tower? And now you would dream of doing that.
It's just amazing. Sometimes, it's like a Broadway show. If they applaud the set, you're in trouble. My training as a set designer, believe me.
So, I mean, does that answer? I mean,
Okay.
there's really so many levels to.
It's just, it can spread out so wide.
Yeah. Well, the Riverwalk, is it Riverwalk in Austin, Texas? That's a.
San
The
Antonio.
river
Oh,
walk
San Antonio. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
in San Antonio.
San Antonio.
It's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Absolutely.
Riverwalk is part of it there.
No, the Riverwalk, however, made San Antonio something special. Hemisphere did not really. No, Hemisphere had some inherent problems that were not of a design or architectural problem. And what the residual benefit was the multicultural building, which I think remained well after for good purpose. But the rest of the expo site wasn't much.
Look at the St. Louis World's Fair. Their buildings and museums, and the Forest Park is all part of that. That's one of our biggest attractions.
That's correct. That's correct. That's where it worked. There's are times when it hasn't worked. Everybody who starts to talk about a world exposition really believes that they have a vision for the post-expo use of the site, that they have the residual, they do the numbers, they do all of that stuff, and it doesn't always happen. Seville was supposed to have this huge theme park on the island, and they did open one, but it failed. Now they're talking about rejuvenating it. It was a new site for an expo. So not everything works. London's fabled Millennium effort was just a tragedy. Tragedy. That site. Still a tragedy. I was just in London, and man, no way you can improve upon failure like that.
But I mean, it's fun to talk about the failures, but you really do have to remember all the successes.
Oh, far outweighed.
Expo '86 in Vancouver.
Oh, absolutely.
Vancouver wouldn't be Vancouver without Expo '86. In the most recent podcast I did, which we've recorded, which we haven't quite edited and put it out there yet. We talked with the man in charge of the South Bank in Brisbane, and how that whole area was redeveloped thanks to Expo '88. And I mean that's a miracle story of what's happened in Brisbane.
The successes far outweigh the
But it's more fun to talk about the failures.
Well,
So it's easier. It's easier to
funny.
come up with reasons not to do something than to come up with reasons to do it. So
No, in vast majority, the benefits to the communities that have hosted world expositions have been enormous. Just enormous.
I mean, we are 106 years after the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, and people still go down to Forest Park looking for parts of it. If people in, what would it be, 21, 26 are still coming, looking for remnants of Expo 2020, then
You go to Grafton, the bars from the original World's Fair, he advertises that fact. So just that bar alone that was at the World's Fair is an economic advantage to this person. So yeah, it just goes on and on.
yeah, I doubt that was in the projections back in 1904, the benefits.
Well, thank you. Is there any other comments before we?
Thank you all.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
everybody.
Thank you for inviting
Pleasure
me.
to be
Yeah.
here.
Great.
Pleasure being here.
Thank you. Yeah.
So many thanks to the panel and to Steve Heckler for inviting me to be a part of their panel that day. And many, many thanks to the very capable audio staff of the convention who supplied me with the audio recording for the podcast that you just heard. As you might imagine, the Expo 2020 story is just beginning, and as we find out more about bids from around the world, and hopefully here in the United States, we will keep you appraised of them here on the World's Fair podcast and on expomuseum.com. In the next episode, we will be talking with Malcolm Snow, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the South Bank Corporation in Brisbane. We'll be talking with him about the Expo '88 Legacy site and where it's come since 1988 and where it's going in the future. As always, there are many ways to contact us. You can reach me at urso@expomuseum.com. That's URSO at expomuseum.com. The World's Fair podcast information and show notes is at worldsfairpodcast.com. Expo Museum is at expomuseum.com. Foundation Expo 88 is at foundationexpo88.org. You can also find out about bidding for Expo 2020, as well as the Expo 2017-2018 section at expobids.com. The World's Fair podcast is also on Facebook at facebook.com/World's Fair podcast. And it would be great if you went on there, hit the like button, and leave a message saying, what you'd like to hear in the future, and give us some feedback there. We're also on Twitter at Expo Museum, at FExpo88. Myself, I'm on there at Urso Chappell, URSOCHAPPELL. And news of the likely bid for our World's Fair in Silicon Valley is at 2020 World's Fair. As always, I'd like to thank our audience for listening. It's been really satisfying to get all the feedback that we've gotten, but we would really like more. So you can do me a favor. I am asking you right now, listening right now at your computer, send us an email and let us know that you're listening. Go on Facebook. Tell us what you think. Alternatively, you can call our comment and question line at 650-ASK-EXPO. That is in the country code of 1. If you're outside the United States and Canada, 650-ASK-EXPO, ASKEXPO. We really, really would like feedback. Even if it's just to say, hey, I've been listening. I don't know why I'm listening. It's really boring. Or, hey, it's really great, and I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. Or, lay off on the old stuff or lay off on the new stuff. Just, tell us what you think and what you want to hear. Because we're right now fleshing out the next few episodes. And I think we have some interesting guests, but it's always good to know what you want to hear and what people are interested in general. Again, thanks.